Azama is one unit you've looked at and thought, oh, another healer, boring, and never used. But what if I told you he's much more than that? In fact, he's not even your typical staff user at all, should you go with his vanilla class. Let's take a look at what games he's in, and how he starts in each one. Azama is playable in both Birthright and Rev of Fire Emblem Fates. In Birthright, he joins you pretty early in the game, in Chapter 7, along with Hanoka and Setsuna. You just got Sakura recently, and likely still have Felicia or Jacob, depending on whether you're using male or female Corrin. Odds are everyone's still in their base classes, they're probably still alive, so why use Azama, who starts out staff-locked and monk? What does he do that Sakura and your other staff user can't? Most people see a staff-locked unit and think, squishy future magic user. And a lot of them historically have been. But the funny thing is, that's the exact opposite of what Azama becomes. See, in Birthright, you get the Hoshidan units. They're typically classes like Sword Masters and Master Ninjas, who are very fast, but not very durable. The traditionally tankier units such as Great Knights and Generals aren't widely available in Birthright. Except that Azama can be an Armor Knight in disguise. So, the Monk class is strictly a staff user, but when it promotes to Great Master, it gains access to Lances or Naginata as well, making Azama pretty much a Spearmaster who sacrifices the extra crit and S-weapon rank for staff utility. But there's a bit of an issue. Monk, while perfectly viable, isn't really what Azama wants to be locked to, especially with so many healers before him. I feel that this may be the game's hint to look into reclasses. Well, that and his support with Rinka. Don't get the wrong idea. Great Master is, well, great, but going through Monk isn't. My recommendation is making him an apothecary, immediately. This might sound weird, I know, but I have my reasons. Apothecary, like Monk, is a bit of a weird and kind of rare class. It's like a slower, tankier archer class. It promotes into the Merchant, which, like Monk and the Great Master, gains lances. This allows Azama to fight as early as his join map. No one in Fates Gen 1 starts in the Apothecary, meaning all of Azama's competition will also require a Heart Seal at least. His closest real competition is a reclass to Boro, and even then he either ties or flat out beats her in all growths, except Res, by only 10%. And that's, you know, Res. So he established that Azama is the best candidate early on for Apothecary, an offensive class. But what about the E-rank weapon and bows? Well, even if Azama stayed in Monk and promoted to Great Master, he'd still have to put up with at least E-rank and lances. The good news is, Azama reclassed immediately near one-shots a lot of enemies at base in his join map with just a Brass Yumi. His hit rate is a bit shaky, but it's not too bad and nothing that a dual strike can't patch up. Even with a crappy E-rank weapon, he's still doing a lot of damage. Another aspect that works great on Azama is that Apothecary gets good skills as a reclass. It gets Quick Salve, which lets the unit use a vulnerary or similar recovery item, as well as perform another action, such as attacking. This is already great, but couple that with the next skill it gives, Potent Potion, which allows healing items and tonics to be 150% effective. For example, a vulnerary heals 15 HP now, and a tonic will give +3 rather than +2 in a stat. Obviously this isn't a strictly Azama thing, but Azama does make the best use of this class. Azama naturally has an amazing growth in HP of 75% and 50% in defense as an apothecary. This is especially great in a game like Fates where very few units actually have that much HP. He will easily have HP in the high 30s and 40s during mid-game, and by endgame his HP will be in the upper 40s, maybe even in the 50s. Few units can say that in this game, regardless of route. Back to his offense, in early Birthright it's so good, even as a dual striker he can do damage on par with the main attacker. So he's not just purely good as a defensive unit. His biggest drawback as a Bowlock tank is just not really having one in range. But in early game Birthright Lunatic, that's not really that big of a deal. Simply being able to pull enemies with no risk is better than what most of the cast can do early on. Azama is sort of the guy you can throw in during early game and be confident he'll make it out alive. Closest unit comparison I would make with him in Birthright Lunatic would be like Osborne and FE7. Both aren't exactly the fastest units around, though after a few levels they will start to double some things. In Azama's case, his speed will get high enough he should be able to double most things, especially in Birthright. They both have a lot of HP and defense to the point they'd almost never get one shot, and they even have the decentish res, so they don't immediately just crumble to one magic attack. Apothecary Azama has most of the advantages of Armor Knights, with zero of the disadvantages, such as low movement, low speed, being allergic to mages, and having to worry about armor slaying. There aren't even effective weapons against bows, so as an Apothecary he shouldn't be taking effective damage. I'm not going to go through an explanation of what Apothecary Merchant Azama can manage on each map, but I will go through an overview on the maps I found him particularly handy in, so like the maps that he really shined in. Chapter 10 is probably the first one that comes to mind with the ninjas. If you reclass him in his join chapter and have been at least chipping on a good few enemies, by now he should have a D rank and bows, so he has access to the Iron Yumi. I like Rinka as a pair-up partner for Azama, so I was trying to get him to export Rinka. She gives him +4 strength and +2 defense, which makes him even more of a beast. So that pair up with Rinka, and having access to the Iron Yumi, and in range of Hinoka's passive support, he usually was in range of one-shotting ninjas. Even if not, he's doing major damage to pretty much anything he touches, and receiving little to no damage in return. Even though you get Takumi on this map, having a second hard-hitting archer still helps a lot. Plus, you do have to remember he's much tankier than Takumi still. The only unit you have access to at this point that can be roughly on par with Apothecary Azama in terms of defense will be Guard Naginata Hinoka or Silas, the latter of which needs to train in Lance rank for that, and in Hinoka's case, her HP is significantly lower than Azama, so you still gotta keep more of an eye on her. Chapter 11 is a boat map with a bunch of flyers that Azama can mostly go solo on by this point, and again with a Rinka pair-up maybe. Even that's probably not necessary though. He's taking little to no damage and pulls flyers on enemy phase, and kills them on player phase. I was putting the flyers going to the top left of the boat. Some of those flyers are Malignites with 1-2 range, so you can position yourself at the edge of their range to kill them on enemy phase. He's also pretty good at taking out the boss, who is rather scary for most other units due to his killer axe, but not really too threatening for Azama, however, just due to his jacked defense. You should be gaining a lot of EXP on Azama in this map due to just all the flyer kills, some of which are even promoted. So yeah, he should be getting a ton of levels here, and you want that. The next chapter, Azama should also be getting a chance to shine. At this point, I stopped pairing him up with Rinka, they reached nice support. I ended up using Kaden as a speed pair-up bot, since Azama is usually just shy of doubling. You can just skip this map, of course, but if you want the treasure like I did, you'll probably want to rush. Or just wall up with Azama. Azama could, at this point, even hold out against Xander. And Xander is a scary guy. His damage output plus relatively high crit chance makes him quite scary. He had no crit on Azama. Azama also didn't really take much damage against the other enemies, so he could just handle many attacks on an enemy phase. Like I said earlier, he's like the armor you just never get in Birthright. Unfortunately though, he's not really good at dishing the damage back to Xander, though perhaps a better pair-up would allow for that. I'll leave for you guys to figure out. Nothing in the mid-game following this is particularly noteworthy. I guess you could say he has a little bit of a niche use in Chapter 14 where there's just quite a few scary enemies there. Even then, he didn't really shine much there. This is where I actually promoted Azama to a merchant and started working on his Lance rank. The mid-game is probably the perfect time to work on his Lance rank. By now, he was the tankiest unit in my army going off stats alone. I could easily plop him in front of most any sort of enemy, and he can retaliate with a lance, doing significant, if not fatal damage, with even just a brass naginata. You know, just a crappy E-rank weapon, he can do all that. I say mid-game is best for this because enemies are at their relative weakness at this point of the game. They're not the lowest level, but compared to your army, you just got Ryoma and Scarlet, and a lot of your units are just promoted or about to promote. If there is a point in the game to work on lousy weapon ranks, right now is the time. You know, right at this point in the game. Do it now. For the next several chapters, Azama stays sweeping, but most everyone else also has an easy time, so that's not really special if he's not really standing out. However, I would like to highlight Chapter 21, the Volcano map. I should quickly note, I reclassed Azama to Great Master now. He's had Profiteer for some time now. He gains a little bit of speed. Overall, the classes stat-wise don't change too much, but I do like the staff utility. The difficulty is starting to ramp up a bit again, and there's just a lot of nasty stuff here, like the golems and their dumb long-range rocks. Azama shrugs these boulders off like they're acorns, though. He also doesn't really face a lot of damage from a lot of the more normal enemies. Azama really just shines here due to being able to clean up a lot of the nastiness most of your other units just don't really want to deal with. I'm not saying it's impossible or near impossible without him, but this map becomes a lot less of a headache, and you want to have fun when you're playing a game, right? And he makes the bad stuff not as bad. Also, being able to one-round or near one-round the enemy heroes and Swordmasters with a Swordmaster is very satisfying. The only real thing Azama has to worry about is the magic enemies, which are pretty uncommon anyway on this map. Now for the big map people probably want to hear about. Chapter 23, the Camilla map in the sewers, on Lunatic. How did Great Master Azama fare? So, I'm going to be honest, there's a lot of magic enemies here, and this is the beginning of late Birthright really pushing the player to start juggernauting with 1-2 range units. Azama obviously has access to javelins, but you really want 1-2 range that can double and preferably one round. You are not one-rounding with a javelin, I'm sorry. It's just not happening. So it was this point in the game where Azama did start to fade a bit in relevance due to just not really having a good 1-2 range option. And you can certainly reclass him to get like shurikens or something to help him out, but I didn't do that, and that's more reclassing that people probably don't want to do. It is possible, it's just you're not going to have it readily available, and you're probably not going to want to train him with E-rank weapons at this late in the game, but I guess it's an option. It's just that's not what happened for me. He can definitely last quite a while against physical enemies, but removing them quickly over enemy phase is what is needed. He was still able to pull and handle strictly one-range enemies just fine. He can sweep them quite quickly. If anything, his step utility was far more useful than his actual combat here. Camilla spams the Dragon Vein every turn, so you want as many healers here as possible. As Azama caps ended up being too low for his monstrous growths, I ended up reclassing him back to Merchant, where he also capped his strength and defense. I realized I had plenty of staff users even without him, as I was using Jacob, a generic maid, Orochi, and Sakura, which would be plenty of staff users anyway. Azama was still a great physical tank and damage dealer, even through the Garen map. But undoubtedly, the high numbers of magic enemies did render him to be no longer a carry like he was early on. Still, even if he couldn't just wall half the map, I pretty much had a very good offensive unit still. Azama's strength is pretty much on par with a Berserker. He should do well in pretty much any physical class, offense-wise. Even despite him not being a carry in the last 5 or so chapters, he never really fell off. It wasn't like, you know, his strength isn't good enough now, his defense isn't good enough. No. They're still great, it's just I didn't have as much use for him. It's easy to be a good unit in endgame, where everyone's trained and given the preferential treatment, but it's hard for most units to stand out with very little investment, you know, at base. And Azama can definitely do that. Now, some may argue a Heart Seal is a hefty investment, but I disagree. Bar Corrin, there's few units that actually get remotely as much mileage out of just one Heart Seal. In my opinion, Azama doesn't have that type of competition. Only really Corrin really wants that besides him. No one else really needs it. Oh, they can get a Spousal Seal or whatever. They can get a Friendship Seal, but Azama really wants that Heart Seal. And I could see the argument for someone saying that you want to give it to Corrin, but I think Corrin can hold out a little bit. With Azama's Birthright performance out of the way, let's talk about his viability in Rev. I won't lie, compared to his pure combat prowess of Birthright, he does do much worse in Rev, though most units are the same in that regard. However, he does still hold some less conventional strong points in Rev Lunatic. See, enemies skill much higher in Rev than Birthright, so you will often see enemies in late Rev doing 50 plus damage. Very scary stuff. He's no longer the tankiest unit in town either, with access to the Norians. Azama still does out-tank even most of the Norians, but Xander and Benny do tend to be more tanky. They both also have a bit more HP. However, he does have a much easier time reaching doubling thresholds, and has slightly higher luck. I ask you to remember that luck stat though. It'll be important. Just trust me. Funny story is, I first tried Azama on this route. See, it all began when I was streaming Rev Iron Man, and I planned to make Midori my money unit for Rev. Well, it turns out her growths really weren't kicking in that run, and I'm sure you could just say, oh well, aren't you just being mean to you at that time? But her speed base is pretty terrible, typically speaking. Like, relative to her level, it's usually pretty bad. I know you can get the child units at different points in the game, but her base speed, unless you reclass her, is really bad. So she ended up becoming a semi-tanky unit with meh HP and awful speed. Not really a great unit for actual combat. But I wanted someone that could become a merchant for Profiteer, and actually be good at it. Someone in my chat then proposed the idea of using Azama, as that is his reclass. Me, having never seriously used Azama, was surprised at this, but I was even more surprised at just how high his growths were. I was like, oh wow, those are his growths? And after hearing that, I was actually very interested in trying him out. And I think a lot of people would if I just showed them his growths. His growths are absolutely bonkers. So let's start at the beginning. Azama in Rev starts much later and in a much worse position. You get him with Hinoka's squad, plus Ryoma and Scarlet in Chapter 16. He is bumped up from level 7 to level 13 as a monk, though that's not particularly impressive. While I could see the argument to keeping him in monk a bit in Birthright, I'd highly advise against it here. The counter-argument to reclassing for Azama is that healers generate their own experience. I agree, and that is a good point typically. But the enemies are already getting tough. They're already out-leveling you. Most of them are already promoting. From Vala onwards, which starts in Chapter 18 by the way, so only 2 chapters from now, everything is promoted with few and very rare exceptions. Those enemies are beefed up. You want to try getting your units up and ready to face strong promoted enemies as quickly as possible. This is where reclassing comes in. Getting those promoted kills is by far the fastest way to get Azama tons of levels and fast, and that's exactly what you want. I can usually get Azama to or very close to level 20 on this map. It does require setting up and feeding kills, which I realize is an investment, but my argument is that odds are by this point most of all your other units are probably promoted and not getting as much out of gaining kills by now. But Azama can even get a lot of EXP from just the unpromoted enemies. Don't do pair-ups here, do dual strikes. Dual striking with a hammer or armor slayer, at least in the right circumstances, will let you even be able to kill the likes of the enemy generals here, with that just your brass bow or Yumi Apothecary Azama normally couldn't even scratch. Obviously, don't use a hammer against something that's, like a berserker or something, like, use your brain. But what I'm saying is that even against the generals that have the highest defense, you can still indirectly feed Azama the kill. Azama will suffer from low weapon rank, unfortunately, for even longer, because his EXP growth will far outpace his weapon EXP growth. So, even in Chapter 17, assuming I'm assuming you're promoting level 20, you might promote at level 15, I don't know. You'll probably be training up his lance rank as a merchant from E rank. So why go through all this work in just a short period of time? Why bother? Why give him like 10 levels? Why give him, why put him through all this E rank garbage? Why? Why should I do that? Why should I do it this late in the game? Why should I train up this random guy? Money. Rev is stingy with its money. You want money. Items and weapons cost a lot in Fates, and you don't get much money. You've not gotten a single coin since like Chapter 10 at this point. And unless you're doing like DLC grinding, or you did like a specific paralog. Azama isn't the only unit that can become a merchant, obviously, but he is probably the one that gets the best use out of the class. And his high growths across the board do not go to waste here. You want all the money you can get, and Merchant Azama can help with that. This is why you want that good luck stat. Remember I was talking about that? This is why. The higher the luck, the better the chance of gold bars. Some will argue that, oh, you can get Midori earlier and she has better luck. That's true. But I feel like I just used her solely for money and nothing else. She was disappointing combat-wise. Like, yeah, I guess you could use her. No one's stopping you, but I do feel like he does a much better job at fulfilling that role. And Rev is also kind of stingy with his deployment slots, so deploying them both might not really be a good idea. Well, maybe. I guess it depends who you're using, but you don't want your best guys, because you're only allowed to use less deployment slots. Personally, I'd rather not be using slots for someone just to make some money. I'd want a good combat unit too. And Azama does that. And should you choose, you can reclass him back to Great Master for a staff unit that can generate money and be counted on to fight reliably when necessary. In a game where slots are so limited, you want to get the most out of each of your units. Azama can perform the role of something like 3 or 4 units in one. That's saving a lot of slots. His high luck helps him avoid annoying crit chances from most enemies as well. For that reason, he's a great Swordmaster killer. He has enough defense that he takes little to no damage from them, enough luck that he typically does not face crit, and even if he does, he's not really risking much, and even enough speed to avoid getting dulled by them, typically speaking, at least until the very high stats of late Vala, which is like Chapter 23 onwards. Unlike in Birthright, I don't find any particular chapter he's really pulling through for me, but I find he overall performs a lot of niche functions well. He's not the best in the game at each thing he does, but he's able to be very flexible with minimal reclassing. He's a jack of all trades, and he's a really good one. He's not the best tank in Rev, but among the best. He is not the best damage dealer, but among the best. He's not the best Profiteer proc in the game, but his luck is still pretty high. You see my point? Most of the best units in one niche can't really do the other one simultaneously well. Azama can. He's great because some turns you just need all the units you can to go on the offensive, like hard player phase, you know? And then maybe other turns you need to heal or to tank. Him being a tanky healer, he can be near the front lines, healing at close range if need be, and he can afford to actually take a hit or two. You know, a lot of your other healers, you know, they take a stray weak attack and they're already dead. Azama can take quite a bit. In Rev, he has that versatility that you want units to have when you have very limited deployment slots. The biggest drawback to Azama is joining so late. As I am nearing the end of this video, I think I should at least briefly shine on Azama's daughter, Mitama. If Azama gets an S support with a compatible female unit, you unlock Mitama's paralog. The paralog itself is pretty easy and yields a lot of EXP, so it is worth doing, should you unlock it. This is very plausible in Birthright, not so much so in Rev unless you have a plan for him. As a second generation unit, you can inherit one skill from her father and one from her mother. What I like to do is have her inherit Profiteer from Azama, thus saving money on heart seals. You pass down whichever your last skill in the list is. You can rearrange it until you get your desired skill. This way you can have 2 Profiteer units for the price of 1, saving even more money now. Mitama as a combat unit, unlike her father, doesn't have his legendary HP growth, sadly. However, like her father, she has great physical stats and even better speed, as well as relatively good luck. I personally made her an Oni Chieftain, where she mostly ended up using magic as a decent all-around tank, though I wouldn't really recommend replicating this as her magic is middling at best. I even fed her a lot of stat boosters for that. I would not recommend that, unless you just really want to do that. She's best as a physical unit. Think Axis or something. Her magic growth isn't great, so if you have a niche for a physical weapon type that you want, I'd recommend making her into that. Despite her magic being underwhelming, she really did carry my late game Birthright run. Amazing defense and solid res made her reliable to send in when almost no one else was. In Birthright, the Profiteer stacking is probably not necessary, but in Rev, if you can give Mitama, I'd 100% recommend it. Again, you want all the money you can get. Hypothetically, you could get Mitama to carry Profiteer and pass it down to Kana to have 3 Profiteer procs per map. Crazy, it's only taken 8 years and I finally found something Kana can do well. Though odds are if you're not grinding, you probably couldn't really get Kana besides maybe for the last 2 chapters. I suppose maybe if you were unlocking and saving a ton of paralogs maybe, but you really don't want to do this paralog so late. Back to Mitama though, solid unit, just don't expect her to quite live up to her father's potential. In summation for Azama, he's a unit I find highly underrated. A lot of people never use him, and I feel like his first impression of being a healer doesn't really encourage players to try him. But if they saw his reclass bases and growths, they'd change their minds in a heartbeat, I think. In Birthright, he's probably the best tank you have and can carry through the early game. In Rev, he's not really the juggernaut he once was, but can fall back upon his diverse utility that still gives him a lot to work with. He can use those as well in Birthright, it's just kind of overkill there. The extra money is just not really necessary. Birthright consistently also has a lot more slots to deploy, so you don't need to really have Azama do 2 or 3 different things. Because of this, I'd argue Merchant might be a bit better for him in Birthright just due to the higher caps, and Greatmaster in Rev just due to the better utility. I'm well aware that the enemy stats are higher in Rev, I even said that, but I think it's more that he just can't really keep up as well, so you might as well just try to give him more niches to do. You don't have to, you can certainly make him a merchant in Rev, it's definitely viable. It's just I personally like doing that. Of course, I'm not saying you must do things exactly like how I play. I made this video because I thought Azama really deserved a second look, and while there is a video already out about him on YouTube, it paints him in a bit of a worse light than I think is fair. I won't deny he does have shortcomings, but I think people don't give him credit where it is due for him. He can also provide another solid unit with his daughter Mitama that technically still counts in his favor, as you will need to at least deploy him if you want to get Mitama. You might as well use both. Azama is absolutely worth it, so the next time you boot up Birthright or Rev, give Azama a try. You might be pleasantly surprised. If you stuck through this video the whole way, thank you. And to my fellow enlightened Azama bros out there, I actively encourage you to share your crazy builds I haven't touched upon or thought of. If there is some point I forgot to touch upon or didn't emphasize enough, absolutely go for it in the comments section. Absolutely. At the end of the day, I would just want to see Azama get the chance he deserves.